So, welcome back to Silmarillion Total War once again, and to another battle replay. I've been given a few more Silmarillion replays in terms of density than I've been given pretty much since it first came out, really. All of which have been either given to me directly or pointed out by Lord of Belagos, so big thank you to him. He's the one who sent me this one, and we're going to be seeing this battle from his perspective as well, on a map which we haven't seen on Silmarillion before either, which is this rather intriguing settlement here with lots of little waterways. It looks a little bit constricted in here. While it does take up a fair amount of the map over here, there is only so much room you have to actually manoeuvre in here, which could be both a good and bad thing for both the attackers and the defenders. This map, I believe, is called TOL SIRION in reference to the large tower that we see over here, albeit you can't actually you can take up a position at the top of this tower if you wish, although all of the defenders would have to cross over these wetlands over here and post up around this singular tower, which probably isn't going to be the case. I think they are instead going to post up around the settlement, which makes life a little bit more interesting from our perspective, I think. But yeah, it's good to have a little bit more Silmarillion on the go. I think ever since the Grey Elves of Mithrim were added, there have been a few more density of replays that Belagos has wanted to send to me, which is very nice indeed. But this is the defending team, so we'll be going through the attackers first of all. I don't think there's any real theme to this battle as such, mainly because I know there's an Orcish faction on the defence and the other two factions are Elven, so it is what it is from that perspective, but that's not really the most important thing here. The most important thing is that we have a rather intriguing siege in prospect. Starting off then with the first of the attacking armies, we have the House of Fingolfin, played by Finarfin. Fingolfin, of course, one of the factions that splits itself between its Elven and human contingent, both of which accent one another very nicely. I think in terms of overall faction balance, Fingolfin has probably got the most well-rounded faction in the game, at least from what I would say. Herdsmen of Mithrim here on the front line in rather large numbers. They're rather basic as far as an archer goes in Silmarillion, and they actually have a relatively limited amount of ammunition, but the real selling point behind them, of course, is the fact that they turn into pretty decent shock infantry when all is said and done, and they're not too expensive in the grand scheme of things either, so you get a few decent volleys from afar, and then you get an armour-piercing infantry unit in melee. They're not the most survivable unit in the world, but they are pretty multifaceted, and they make a good accompaniment to a lot of the Elven units that you can bring as the House of Fingolfin. Speaking of which, the Dragon Guard of Dorlomin are here, the axe thrower unit that was added not in the most recent patch, but when, I believe, when the Avari and the Horrors of Nandan Gorthab were added. The Dragon Guard were added around the same sort of time, and this gives you obviously a nice throwing projectile that you can use, which is a little bit more venomous than the Marines of Vinyamar, and also I believe a little bit up to a little bit more in melee as well, but obviously you're going to be paying for the premiums on units such as this. Speaking of which, we do have the Marines of Vinyamar in behind here as well, so a bit of javelin action as well, plenty of throwing projectiles, which are going to be useful whether on the attack or the defence when you're in a siege battle like this. You don't want to invest too heavily into them, otherwise archers are going to be the bane of their existence on the approach, but when you get into the sort of more tight confines of a settlement like this one, javelins and axe throwers can be exactly the sort of thing to help dislodge the enemy. Bladesmen of Barad-Ithel are the standard mainline line infantry unit that you get as Fingolfin as well. A very fine unit indeed. A little bit more focused around melee defense than, for example, the Footmen of Amras from the House of Feanor, but this is the kind of unit that you can expect it to be the equivalent to. A very fine unit as well, so they should do pretty well when it comes to an elongated fight in a siege such as this. Interestingly enough, just the one unit of the Sentries of Hithlum here. I mean, one of the factions on the defence is Finarfin, so on this occasion Fingolfin can rely on having a pike advantage over their opponents. Pikes are pretty few and far between in terms of the extra length that pikes tend to have. Sentries of Hithlum will find themselves outgunned by Finarfin's pikemen, but nonetheless it's still a very useful unit to have, like I've said several times when talking about Reforged. If you can keep a unit of pikes like this alive in the late game, and it comes down to a really tightly fought contest, pikes can be the sort of thing which makes it impossible for your opponent to win. So it's good to have at least one unit of them, but of course they'll also be the target of every archer that the defenders have if they move forward too quickly. Speaking of which, Marksmen of Barad-Ithel here at the back, a unit of decent, heavier Elven archers. Again, I say decent, I mean they're fairly unremarkable for the kind of unit that they are and the kind of price that they are considering the other Elven heavier archers that you can see, but they'll do a job just fine. And then the two bodyguard units that Fingolfin have, the defensive one, the Irimo Arantare sword and shield unit, very, very tanky, good melee defense, very tough to wear down. And then of course you have the Sons of Hurin as well, which are far more aggressive, of course, really big charge bonus, armor piercing and melee. They're not going to have the same survivability as the Irimo Arantar, but they're going to more than make up for that with their damage dealing, which when you're on the attack you're going to need to dislodge the defenders somehow. Moving on, we have the Blessed Realm of Valinor, played by Tommy the Wise. We've seen them be very effective on occasion, but also their smaller army sizes have proven to be their downfall as well. But on this occasion, considering they've got a more varied alliance going on with them, hopefully they can bring their quality to bear. Sentries of Alqualonde, a good unit of archers. I mean, relatively lightly armoured. The Teleri units for Valinor are, in contrast to the really high tier stuff that Valinor have, they're relatively speaking much less survivable, but they'll do just fine. I mean, they're the equivalent of many other elven factions, lighter units anyway, so yeah, Sentries of Alqualonde. Nice to have this sort of long range support as well. Just in behind we've got a couple of units of the Peacekeepers of Valimar. Armor piercing spear with multiple HP. This is exactly the kind of thing that Valinor are known for, really, really strong units individually, but obviously it means their armies tend to be significantly smaller. The Plaza Guardians are the two-handed spear variant. They're not a pike unit, so they don't have the same sort of range, but to be honest, the armor piercing makes them an incredibly dangerous unit. I mean, these Valimar units are medium armor in comparison to the Noldor that are just in behind them here, but even still. We've got some Sentries of Tyrion or Sentinels of Tyrion, I should say, the heavy swordsmen, again multiple HP, but again a small unit. So Valinor probably going to be best off with the Hearthguard being the Sword and Shield variant, best off being a supporting tool for their fellow attackers here. And then also we have the Mariners of Alqualonde back here as well, so yeah, more javelins, throwing projectiles that the attackers will be able to utilise. Moving across the wetlands, we have another Fingolfin army actually. So Alexander 10Q has got some herdsmen of Hithlum as well, so we can go through this army a little bit quicker because I imagine there's not going to be too many differences. Bladesmen of Barad-Ithil being brought again, nice mix of attack and defence with those swords and melee defence. Sentries of Hithlum, he's brought 2 units of them instead of just the 1, so something else for the defenders to be on the lookout for. Both bodyguard units have been brought once again. He's brought plenty of Dragon Guard of Dorloman, just like his ally Farkin. 2 units of Marines of Vinyamar. Some Armatar of Barad-Ithil here at the back. So they are individually a slightly stronger variant of the Bladesmen, although they are half strength. But they also have some supporting attributes to them, like buffing the morale of units that are around them. So as part of a combined arms offensive, that could be just the sort of thing to keep these Fingolfin attacks going for longer. And then the final attacking army, we have the Haladin. Once again, we saw them used to good effect in the last battle. Mevin on the receiving end of that, I believe. Or was he one of the Haladin? He was definitely in the battle, but I think he was playing as the Grey Elves, wasn't he? Anyway, Sword of Brothia, we saw them used early in that fight, and they were used to good effect, albeit they had to lay down their lives in order to achieve victory ultimately for the Haladin. But the Relentless trait, the damage they can deal, yes, they're not going to be quite as tanky as the Fingolfin swordsman, certainly not as much as the Valinor swordsman, but they're going to be cheaper, and also that Relentless trait means they're going to be able to deal damage regardless of what the enemy does to them in return. Plenty of Huskarlar, so again, real focus around the throwing projectiles for the attackers here. That's to be expected with the Haladin though, because it's one of the main focuses of their faction. The Huskarlar, standard unit of axe throwers. The dismounted Mardraut of Malduin, we saw the mounted version used to fantastic effect last time we saw the Haladin. And obviously their javelins are going to be pretty deadly as well. More Huskarlar. The rest of the Haladin army of course can hide, so very likely we're going to see a large amount of them pop into existence as the battle goes along. Now then, moving on to the first of the defending armies, we have once again the Grey Elves of Mithrim. We've seen the Grey Elves used in a field battle like last battle, we've seen them used on the attack in the battle just before that. Now we get to see how good they are on the defence. They may have occupied the hill in the last field battle, but it was still very much a pitch battle kind of situation, whereas now they'll be able to dig in and we'll be able to see what they're all about from this perspective. Outlaws of Hithlum, so they're going to be going up against their brethren who have decided to remain loyal to the House of Fingolfin. Throwing axes, again it's going to be interesting to see the throwing projectiles be traded back and forth between the attackers and the defenders. A battle like this is where we'll really get to see what the Grey Elven archers are all about as well. We get to see the Lookouts of Mithrim, which are a unit we haven't seen up till this point. We of course have seen the Bane of the Incomers with their rather wild projectiles. This is the kind of situation though where on the approach the attacking armies could be dealt some real blows by the Bane, so we'll see. Eagle-Eyed of Androth, we've seen them used as well seem to have really good range, really good damage values, but this will be the ultimate litmus test, I think, of how these kind of units do, because in the first battle where we saw the Grey Elves on the attack, it was a little bit more difficult for them to get established given how dug in the Gondolin defensive position was, and in the second battle, obviously in a field battle, things can get a little bit hectic pretty quickly, and they were able to use their archers to good effect, but not over the length of time I'm sure they would have wanted to. We've got some Hunters of Mithrim as well, which would appear to be javelin men. And we've got some Sword Bearers of Mithrim. They were used to pretty good effect in the last battle, but it wasn't enough ultimately to see the Grey Elves be victorious. Sentries of Mithrim, which are the Spear variant. The Hewing Guildsmen of Androth we've seen used to good effect in both battles the Grey Elves have been in up till now. Very damaging unit indeed. And then finally over here we've got the Elders of the Twilight Hearth, which is a very impressive name indeed. Another archer unit, look to have a two-handed spear as their secondary weapon. Interesting to see if they've got any specialty projectiles as well, just like Bane of the Incomers. And finally, we have the Scions of TOL, which, you know, very small unit, but going to be very effective at dealing that armor-piercing damage, which could be exactly the sort of thing that's needed against the upper-end Fingolfin units and the elite parts of the Valinor army. We shall see. The one and only Orcish faction on the field today is going to be the Dominion of TOL and Gaurhoth, played by Tundra's Fox. He's got some Hishtbuk Kraz Zagulakla, so some javelin cavalry, both the half-strength and full-strength version. They are the lower end of the cavalry that TOL and Gaurhoth can bring, the Hishtbuk Kraz, but they've got plenty of variants of wargs, but going for the more numerous variant here so they can perhaps make the advance across the wetlands for the attackers just that little bit more uncomfortable. Over here we have some Hishtbuk Kraz Howlers. They're a locked morale unit, dual wielding, but they're very low tier, and considering the kind of forces they're going up against, even the Haladin's units like the Sword of Brothia are going to be really good at dealing damage to the Hishtbuk Kraz, but the real selling point is that locked morale. You're going to have to kill all of them before you can actually get them out of the way, so that's one thing that they have in their favour. We have some Scarahai Longfangs. So again, all of these throwing projectiles are going to be a very big factor in this battle, and TOL and Gaurhoth, in conjunction with having a big warg contingent, throwing projectiles is one of those things that they certainly have as a main focus for their faction as well. So plenty of these Longfangs here, throwing axes. We have some Hishtbuk Kraz Hunters, a very basic archer, but again, archers outside of the Grey Elves, none of the factions outside of maybe Farkin's Fingolfin army has invested heavily in their archers, but even then that's much more of a flash in the pan when you consider how much ammunition the Hithlum archers have. Scarahai Longfangs, plenty of these Longfangs here, so lots of throwing axes. More Hishtbuk Kraz Hunters. We have the Hishtbuk Kraz Ash Priests, very, very deadly of course, relentless, 3 HP, really strong in melee, as well as those explosive Nafatoon-esque projectiles that they traffic in at range. Kind of a no-brainer to have in a siege like this, especially if it comes down to a closely fought encounter within the settlement in the late game. If they still have ammunition, it could be absolutely devastating for the attackers. Scarahai Trappers are the javelin variant of the Longfangs we've already seen. The Mangonel, if you can set that up into a good position, in conjunction with the Bane of the Incomers as they advance across the wetlands, that could be really, really dangerous for the attackers as well. We have got some Scarahai Trappers. We have Sauron himself, which you can see he's actually got his more of a first stage appropriate look to what he would have had, as opposed to the crowned visage that he sports in the third age and second age. But yeah, Sauron, Lord of Wolves, a single entity unit. I think the only single entity unit we're going to be seeing, but still a very deadly one at that. Hishtbuk Kraz Pyre Wolves, another ranged cavalry unit. Trappers, and then we have another cavalry unit way back here as well, another unit of Pyre Wolves. So it's an interesting army, this. A huge proportion of this army is actually ranged units, throwing projectiles and archers. Very little in the way of their standard infantry, especially with their Gijak Scarras, so no heavier units. Perhaps more of a supporting role they're going to be playing, but that's a dangerous thing to get involved in. It's going to be really down to Finarfin over here, played by Lord of Belagos, to be that bulwark on the front line when you consider the kind of compositions that the Grey Elves and TOL and Gaurhoth have brought to the field today. They've got a catapult, which again, going to make the advance that little bit more dangerous. The initial advance for the attackers may be where they've come unstuck a little bit. A couple of units of Archers of Talathdin in, making use of the waterways, the canal-like waterways that they have at the front of this settlement. Plenty of Swordsmen of Talathdin in, yet more Javelins, again, going to be a very big part of this battle. Also a fine infantry unit as well to boot. While in the interior of the settlement, Wardens of Nargothrond, armor-piercing spearmen are very useful against the kind of forces they're going to be coming up against. Defenders of Taloth-Dinin, Wardens of Nargothrond, plenty of spears. We have the Arqueni Mormagilwa, fantastic unit of heavy swordsmen. Will be really good actually against the lighter elements of Fingolfin. Valinor as well actually, now that I think about it, and the Haladen. We also have the Bridge Wards of Nargothrond. Last time we saw Finarfin, they didn't have the Bridge Wards, and I think they came to regret that. Lord of Belagost, it is the obvious thing to do, but bringing the Bridge Wards to be that centre of their defence. Swordsmen of Taloth-Dinin, we have some Wardens of Nargothrond. Once again, the General actually finds himself in the company of Prince Gwyndor. Saw them in the last battle as well. Second unit of Bridge Wards, and that's pretty much it, I believe, with some Marksmen of Nargothrond up here on the high ground to use their split-shot projectiles as well, something else that could be dangerous as the attackers transit through the river delta here. But yeah, I will make a cut and we'll rejoin when the first volleys are being unleashed. Not as much of a gap, I must say, as I was expecting from the start of this one, as the catapult begins to open up on the Fingolfin army as it moves forward, bombarding them as they advance closer to the settlements in the distance. Interestingly enough, sounds like the catapult crew themselves have actually got the throwing projectile sound effect as they launch their projectiles from the catapult. In having a look here, they've managed to hit some of the Dragon Guard of Dor Lomin primarily. The Herdsmen of Hithlum also on the front line. What are they actually going after? Maybe the more closely packed units of the Bladesmen of Barad-Ithor behind this hill? I would suggest they're probably not going to hit them. I mean, if they do, it would be very fortuitous, but so far the catapult shots only doing somewhat minor damage, it must be said. Over here, Valinor also moving forward, but like I said, I think Valinor, they would probably be best off as a finishing move, for lack of a better term, on the defenders, if anything, because of the relatively small size of their army, the very elite nature of a lot of the units they brought. They brought quite a lot of the Valimar units and the Tyrian units, the quality of which cannot really be matched by much else on the field. Maybe the Bridge Wards would fancy their chances against them in a straight-up fight because of the extra range on those pikes, but outside of that, there really isn't all that much from the defenders that can go toe-to-toe with them. Archers of Taloth-Dinin with maybe the initial threats of starting to loose some volleys. Looks like the Irimo Arantar have taken a little bit of damage from the catapult as well. I mean, that is significant, but a catapult is expensive, let's not forget. So it needs to do more damage than that in order to pay for itself. Sentries of Hithlum also taking a little bit of damage. The one unit which can match the range of the defending Bridge Wards. Sentries of Alqualonde moving forward, but this is a risky move given the presence of all those wargs on the field. If they don't have the Valimar units right in behind them, they could end up getting charged here, the relatively lightly defended units of Teleri, and immediately the Archers of Taloth-Dinin are going to open up on them. So Valinor are going to need to respond in kind to this pretty quickly. Hishbuk-Krau's Howlers could also move forward and start forcing them on the defence as well as the Herdsmen of Hithlum move in. I mean, constricting around this little defence of Finarfin's, but the waterways that have been dug here make this less of a problem than it would otherwise be. Howlers moving forward. I mean, if we have a look way over here, it's going to take the Haladin and the other Fingolfin army quite a long time to get into position if they intend to walk the whole way, which is probably wise given the fatigue mechanics at play. But it does mean that Valinor and Fingolfin over here do need to be careful. I mean, there's nothing wrong with opening up the skirmishing and trying to do a little bit of chip damage to the defending forces initially, but if they attack too soon, then it's going to be a very fragmented assault. We'll wait and see if that's the case. Eagle-Eyed of Androth getting into position. Archers of Taloth-Dinin taking the initial volleys from the Alqualonde sentries. Again, in terms of skirmishing, I think Finarfin would be okay with this. They are outnumbered, so it is a little bit of a sketchy situation for them. Going after, rather to be expected, going after Valinor's units, just about missing the main body of this line of peacekeepers. They do manage to hit some mariners, but that wasn't the true target there by any means. Still no sentinels of Tyrion back there as well. I mean, the catapult just biding its time for now. Also over here, the Herdsmen of Hithlum starting to open up with their own ammunition. This unit already out of ammunition and pulling out their battle axes. Surprised they haven't pulled back in already, actually. Marksman of Baradital moving forward. I mean, it would be actually better, I think, to send the Marksman of Baradital forward first, if only because they're a little bit more designed for this sort of skirmishing. They've got more ammunition so they can sustain it for longer, and they're going to be tankier than the Herdsmen. And force the Archers of Talathin into submission. Archers of Talathin and that. I mean, Eagle-Eyed of Androth in the background as well, just biding their time. Sentries of Alqualonde moving forward to try and maybe get some more volleys onto those Finarfin skirmishers. They do manage to hit the Sentinels of Tyrion. I mean, this is the problem with the Valinor army, is even a grazing hit still represents a fairly decent chunk of the unit. But it is what it is. I mean, the Valinor skirmishers also need to be careful not to get too close, otherwise the Hishbut-Kraz Howlers will actually fancy their chances of catching the Teleri out with a swift charge. And that would certainly not be what they want. I mean, I suppose in many ways it's actually fortunate for Valinor that a lot of the TOL and Gaurhoth army is not actually infantry. And TOL and Gaurhoth, it's a much more reactive army from TOL and Gaurhoth this time around. As the enemy advance towards them, they will be able to use their skirmishers to good effect, but as long as they stay just out of range, they will want to keep things just as it is. Very basic Hishbut-Kraz hunters. Still going to be capable of doing damage over a longer period of time to the sentries, so again it's a decision that has to be made as the grasslands are set alight by the Mangonel with its first volley. Mariners of Alqualonde would do well not to advance through the fire because it stays active for a little while after it lands, of course. Sentries of Alqualonde going to open up once again. This unit of Archers of Taladin may be depleted, but they can still do damage over a longer period of time. Yeah, this is kind of what I was concerned about from a Valinor perspective. The Hishbut-Kraz are on their way over here now, and the Valinor infantry can't afford to move too far forwards, otherwise it's going to be open to all sorts of skirmish fire. And the Hishbut-Kraz are going to charge in here. It's not going to be a devastating charge, but certainly one that's worthwhile. This will be enough to also coax the spearmen forward. And by far the only player really to have invested in this much cavalry. I mean, as lower end as most of it may be, with the exception of those pyre wolves that you'll have lurking around in the background, that's still going to be very effective at dealing with these sentries, pushing them back. I mean, you obviously don't want to stay in and amongst the peacekeepers. This one Warg Rider is certainly going to perish as a result of this. And that is the catapult that has retreated back inside the settlement. I mean, peacekeepers are moving forward, but they need to be... I mean, they're going to draw the attention of all sorts of skirmish fire now, with archers and the like. I mean, the archers, I think, are actually more of a red herring here. I mean, yes, you could catch them out in melee, but to do so would also mean to take full volleys from all of these javelins. So I think Tommy is actually being drawn in here, and losing any of these Valimar units would be a real tragedy because of how strong they can be in melee later on. Warns of Nargothrond under normal circumstances have got the monopoly on solid armour-piercing spears, but the Peacekeepers of Valimar are a tier above. Hishbut-Kraz Howlers, going to bog them down in melee. The tar pit that they are, of course the Peacekeepers will pretty easily deal with things, but they're shaken here because they're too far ahead of their support. They're going to be taking flaming javelins. Scarahai Longfangs are in behind, another unit of Hishbut-Kraz Zagluklav as well, so yeah, this was not particularly wise from Tommy the Wise. And is this his general? Surely not. Surely he wouldn't have done such a thing. No, that's not his general, that's just an officer. Kinsman of Ingwe unit model. But yeah, this is going to result in them routing. I mean, Valinor's units are obviously very resilient when it comes to their morale, but you can't beat the mechanics of Medieval 2 at their base where, well, they are just about going to save themselves, but more out of the necessity of another unit of Peacekeepers having to move forward. Good opportunity perhaps for the Scarahai Longfangs to also introduce the Peacekeepers here to their throwing axes, and they are going to do that. Yeah, this has been not the most well executed of initial attacks. Like I said, it really should have been Valinor coming through last, I think, but instead they've been baited into coming first, and oh dear, throwing axes doing their thing. I mean, they're not melting in the face of this kind of damage and morale shocks like many other factions would be, but this certainly isn't a good situation for them to be in. Javelins from the Swordsmen of Talathin as well, not armour piercing them, but this is still damage. They're going to be bloodied for later. Their hit points expended. Less of a concern, therefore. Those Tishbuk crowds are getting pounded by the sentries of Alqualonde, but the Tishbuk crowds Howlers obviously still not doing great in melee against this kind of unit, but they've done their thing. They've held them in place for long enough, and not a particularly fruitful advance that from Valinor. The defenders can afford to be pretty pleased with themselves for that. They've managed to somewhat blunt the fangs of some of the dangerous units that Valinor have to offer. They do need to be a little bit careful here. There's Sauron. Already bloodied, actually, so he's taken some arrow fire, but single entity units like that are obviously extremely resilient to this sort of thing, and most of those shots are actually getting the Scarahai trappers in behind, but Hunter's Fox needs to be a bit careful, perhaps. Over yonder, you can see that the Rigswehr of Brethel taking some hits from the lookouts of Mithrim. I mean, the Rigswehr unshielded, as with much of the Haladin army as well. Their armour values are not going to be as solid as the armies that they are facing off against. And also the bane of the incomers there with their scattering projectiles, their exploding projectiles as they are. Again, not dissimilar in terms of effect to what you would expect from the Watcher, so they're going to do a lot of damage here, even to these more spread out elements of the attacking army. And it's, I mean, this is actually somewhat interesting, because under normal circumstances this would be exactly what you want to do as the attacker, spread out your army and try and absorb this damage, but the Bane of the Incomers runs contrary to that in much the same way as the Watcher. They're not going to do tons of damage to an individual target, but if you're spread out like this, they're going to hit something, and they're going to do a lot of damage. While they may only be Fyrdsmen of Dorlomen, or Fyrdsmen of Dorlomen, this is doing a lot of manpower damage to the attackers, and this has been enough to convince Fingolfin to move forward maybe sooner than they would have liked as well. Sentries of Mithrim will probably be able to defeat these Fyrdsmen 1v1 as well. Sword bearers would be, because of the type of weapon that they utilise. Armitar Paradithal moving forward. I mean, it shouldn't be too surprising that Fingolfin are the ones taking the lead here, because they have got the survivability that the Haladin simply do not have. So Fingolfin maybe being the sacrificial lambs early on here, and taking the hits and the punishment for a Haladin-backed Valinor army to maybe win the day for the attackers is what you would expect. Armitar moving forward. Hishbuk Krau's Pyre Wolves in position as well, so the flaming sorcery in the shape of the Greek fire that we're going to see here. Now they may have Witcher-like projectiles, but they're not actually as devastating. As you can see, it looked like a problem, but they only really hit 1 or 2 units at a time, and it's lightly armoured units they're good at against exclusively, really. But the Marines of Vinyamar are not that heavily armoured, and these javelins do represent a potential threat to the defenders, so not too shocking to see them be the targets of all this attention. Warder of Brethel moving forward, more Fyrdsmen of Dorlomen. There's still a lot of these units way back here, so this is really just the beginning. I do appreciate the fact, though, that he hasn't just sent forward his Fyrdsmen of Dorlomen, Alexander Tenku, to effectively perish without any sort of effectiveness laid down, but he sent forward the Armitar, who not only will be able to do the damage that the Fyrdsmen can, but their auras will also mean that the Fyrdsmen stay in melee for just that little bit longer. So he's clearly thought about this. Lookouts of Mithrim, meanwhile, are taking damage. Vinyamar, Warder of Brethel in behind. Meanwhile, let's go and see what's happening elsewhere. Some of the orcs from TOL and Gaurhoth on the way over to help shore up the defence over here. I mean, you can see over here, Marksman Baradithal out of ammunition coming in here to engage with the Hishbuk Raz Howlers, but the fact that Valinor have had to completely scale back their assault over here is a sign of how poorly it went initially. Swordsman of Talafdin in position over here. The Dragon Guard of Dorlomen are over here as well, taking hits. I mean, throwing projectiles are a problem, so it's not too surprising to see them attract some kind of attention from archers in behind enemy lines, even if it is just basic ones. Catapults are there. I mean, they have pulled back a little bit, but this section over here is not accessible unless you get closer to the settlement anyway, at which point you would certainly attract the attention of the hunters, but more worryingly the marksmen of Nargothrond. But maybe we'll be more likely to see the settlement itself start to come into play here, because eventually it will cease to be fruitful for the defenders to be out here, given the amount of angles the attackers can and probably will start to pressurise. Ishbukraz Howlers defeat seems certain even against a depleted unit of primarily archers. They are still losing out, but again, they will have to kill all of them here because of their locked morale, the marksmen, so that's something. Archers of Talathin and the out of ammunition will actually be enough to turn this fight back around in favour of the defenders, so it's a small victory, but these are starting to add up for the defenders, and they need them to. It is a 3v4 after all. Dragon Guard of Dorloman are actually moving in. Did they use their projectiles already? Perhaps they did, and that's why they're putting themselves close to being in harm's way, but they will be coming forward. Axes out, and their presence on the front line will once again flip this fight back in favour of the attackers. Actually, no, it's not axes. Well, some of them have axes, some of them have hammers, so a dual weapon unit. Kind of similar to the Flag Rim over in Reforged from that respect, I suppose. 2 Pyre Walls remain, which means they've been hammered by some kind of skirmishes. Hewing Guildsmen of Androth moving forward. I mean, there's a much more full-blooded encounter now. Bladesmen of Barad-Ithil moving forward in numbers with Feardsmen to back them up. Wrapping around this unit of Scarahai Longfangs as well, so I don't know if they were able to utilise their ammunition before they got pounced on in melee, but this is the downside to having pretty much all of your infantry corps use javelins first and foremost. If you can't use that ammunition, all of a sudden all you really have is a slightly less effective infantry line than you otherwise would have done. So a lightning attack like this may be the best way to deal with things, and then backing it up with the Huskarlar as well. I like the way that this Fingolfin army and their Haladin backup has handled things over on this side, a little bit more so than how things have gone on the other side, where Valinor were coaxed into a fight they probably didn't want to take. Herdsmen of Hithlum moving forward. Armatar of Barad-Ithil still doing their thing. The Huskarlar, they don't have the best of shots into these positions, but a combination of lookouts and Scarahai, most of these being skirmishers. So the Bladesmen of Barad-Ithil will be very, very dominant in fights against units like this. What is going on here? Pyre Wolves, again, they're only going to be able to kill really one kind of unit at a time. They can knock over a decent amount of units as well. Swordsmen of Talathin coming out. Again, not armour-piercing javelins, but they are going to cause these units to stumble, and it will still do damage, of course, so it's the sort of thing which can at least buy them time while support gets into place. And Hewing Guildsmen of Androth, as I've recently learned, are actually armour-piercing, so that's why we've seen them be so effective up till this point, and that is also why the Bladesmen of Barad-Ithil should be concerned about their presence on this front line, but there's plenty of support in place for the attackers here. Scarahai Longfang is going to block any potential transit through these trees for the Huskarlar. Meanwhile, a little bit more like it now. Sentries of Alcolonde going to finish off these Hishtbukras. Mariners of Alcolonde moving forward, and another bite of the cherry for Valinor as the Plaza Guardians are moving forward, and maybe missing a bit of a trick here. The Scarahai Longfangs throwing their axes into the Sentries of Alcolonde when they really could have been doing so against the Plaza Guardians on the advance. That's one aspect where if you're paying attention to something on one side of the battlefield and they move forward when you're not looking, you can miss out on some really good value. And of course the Valimar units with the Dragon Guard of Dorloman are going to easily scatter the Scarahai. Peacekeepers are back, having already taken a bit of damage, but it's interesting the Valimar units have been committed forward relatively early on, given their armour-piercing nature, and the two-handed spears could be helpful later. Scarahai Trappers being engaged by a breakthrough unit of these Peacekeepers as well, and they're always going to struggle here. This is, again, where TOL and Gaurhoth's composition may start to come unstuck a little bit. It takes a lot of concentration to use this many skirmishers, and some of them are inevitably going to get caught out, and those that do are going to be in trouble. I mean, they are still using their throwing projectiles here, and they're using them to pretty good effect as well. This is how they're going to deal damage after all. If they try and fight blow for blow in melee, then it's not going to work for them. So not too surprising to see this. Mariners of Alcolonde doing their thing. Dragon Guard of Dorloman charging forth, going after the Hishtbukras, forcing the TOL and Gaurhoth cavalry onto the defence. There's still Sauron lurking back there, towering over every other unit on the field, but so far he's just been menacingly stood there in the background. But Scarahai Trap has broken, so now Valinor and Fingolfin, with a concerted effort, now that they noticed that resistance was starting to wane a little bit, units starting to get back within the settlement, they moved forward and they were able to break through this primarily TOL and Gaurhoth defence without too much drama. Scarahai Longfangs, a lot of these Trappers and Longfangs, I don't know if they've used up enough of their ammunition to be considered worthwhile, which is concerning for the defenders. I mean, they have been doing damage, but has it been good enough? Have they been blunting the attackers to the extent they would like? Those Plaza Guardians, I mean, they are medium army units, so those Pyre Wolves actually will do the kind of damage that they want. Hearthguard of Tyrion will start doing a good amount of damage to them, though. Again, it looks devastating, but on this occasion, looks are somewhat deceiving. Starting to come out with more units in defence as well. Swordsmen of Haladin, though, don't really stand too much of a chance against these Valimar units. Such as Valkolonde moving in. Fingolfin over on this side still have plenty of units, and they maybe missed an opportunity to utilise the Mangonel effectively as well, given that they're going to want to use it while the attackers are on the advance rather than when they're in a static position. Swordsmen of Talathin and fighting hard. Sword of Brothia were committed at some point. You can see they have been dealt with pretty quickly, so it goes to show the difference in the level of resistance they're facing this time around compared to the last battle we saw the Haladin do very well in. Both of the Fingolfin bodyguard units, I mean, most of these units are just basic Talathin ones, so they are going to be overrun. The outer defences are starting to fall away, which means we'll be seeing the settlement itself be the main bulwark of the defence now, although outside the defence here, still making use of these waterways which will constrict the attackers somewhat. Over on the other side, it's Fingolfin that have got more left, whereas on this side, they've been the ones to take more of the damage, and the Haladen look to be a little bit healthier, which again should be to be expected. Scarlar still doing their thing. They've been used pretty effectively. Warder of Brethil in close proximity. Herdsmen of Hithlum doing their thing as well with those high damage axes. Bane of the Incomers in a pretty good position as well. Valinor have chased the enemy pretty far actually. Scarahai Longfangs being hounded by the Mariners. Swordsman of Talathin in defeat seems certain. Hearthguard of Tyrion taking to the front line as well now, the most effective tank unit really that Valinor have. Swordsman of Talathin and won't be able to do too much damage to them in response. And in conjunction with what's left of this depleted unit of Dragon Guard, I think they're going to be able to sweep this unit away pretty quickly. Over here, more swordsmen, but again, they're going up against the armour piercing of the Valimar spears. So the medium armour that the Talathin units wear is not going to come in too handy on this occasion. Well, over here, Dragon Guard of Double Omen still in large numbers. Fingolfin in general over here are still in pretty good strength. Ishbokras Hunters are up here. I mean, to engage with them, you need to go right through the initial defences, so they're in a pretty good position. Basic archers though they may be, they are going to be backed up by the Evil Eye of Androth as well. Ash Priests are in a really devastating position, so this is where the defenders are going to have to do the telling damage, you would say. As they move into the settlement, there are certain individual positions that their skirmishers can take up. Not tons, there's only a couple. So it's not as if every attack that the attackers make is going to be ripped apart by skirmishers, but some of them will be. And that damage is going to be key here. Scarlar moving forward, still some Rigswear. Or thrown projectile units. So far they have been utilised pretty broadly over the battlefield. Blazesmen of Barad-Ithel celebrating their victory. There's still something of a resistance being mounted out here. There's one unit of swordsmen, but surely with the addition of these herdsmen of Hithlum they will rout. They've held on for longer actually than I ever would have expected, but there they go. For a basic unit, certainly. Meanwhile, Bane of the Incomers up there doing a lot of damage to a big crowd of units, which is what they are designed to do after all. Mariners and Herdsmen of Hithlum may be basic units, but just dealing damage to crowds, that's what they will hope to do here as they move backwards. Sauron is up here now as well. Has the look of one of the Bulldogs from Angband. Rituals of Nargothrond are still going to be a factor in this battle as well, let's not forget. What else do we have going on? Spending their time for now. Any sort of archers doing their thing? Yes. Flaming projectiles from the Elders of the Twilight Hearth, so a good opportunity to see one of the supposedly more impressive units from the Grey Elves, just based on their name and based on their look. You can infer their bodyguard status, doing damage to the Haladen as they move forward. Both the Rigswear and the Huskarlar are throwing projectile units, so it is worthwhile. There are some Warder Brethel in here as well, which are not really worth going after, but this is going to be an opportunity perhaps for the Grey Elven infantry to move forward. A lot of these units, after all, again, are throwing projectiles. We saw TOL and Gaurhoth suffer from this sort of thing earlier on. They may get one volley. They don't even get that in the end because I think they bottled it. I think Mevin saw them coming and tried to run away, and he is going to do so, but not before taking a little bit more damage from the bane of the incomers. The Rigswear of Brethel are also going to be engaged by some hewing guildsmen and some sentries, so a combined arms front line of spears and armour-piercing infantry. Eagle-Eyed of Androth may be out of ammunition as well, but they're going to chip in. And these Rigswear are going to find themselves hopelessly outmatched in melee. Hewing guildsmen. Dismounted Marjars of Malduin. I mean, these are more impressive javelin men, and going after the Hewing guildsmen you could certainly pick worse targets, but they don't seem to be doing the kind of damage quickly that maybe they would have liked. We also get to see the Bane of the Incomers utilise their very blue twin axes. Rigswear of Brethel trying to get some flanking fire with their own javelins. Well, it may not be as impressive as the Marjouts, but as we said for TOL and Gaurhoth earlier on, this is how the Haladen are more likely to deal damage against this kind of foe, even if they're being engaged in melee. Lookouts of Mithrim using their flaming shot as well. Worthwhile tactic of all the attacking factions. The Haladen are most likely to rout under this kind of pressure. Well, over on the other side, are we going to start to see the first forays into the settlements? I mean, the enemy are not going anywhere, so Farkin's going to have to do so at some point, but maybe they're just stacking up on all of the entries first, and then they will begin to move in. I'm hearing some sentries of Alcolonde have moved into the settlements, only 6 of them. How much damage are they really going to be able to do? I mean, slowly but surely against something like the Scarahai, maybe it's worth it. Still no real fights going on other than the ill-fated Haladen attempt to use their skirmishers to whittle down this Grey Elven position, and Mithrim have punished them soundly for it so far, and now they're going to move back into position as well. They've got their Hunters of Mithrim in position. If the Haladen try and do that again, they'll be met with some javelins themselves. More Hunters of Mithrim back there as well. Lookouts. They're in a good position up here. I mean, basic archers by the Grey Elven standards, but in a good position nonetheless. Rigswear with Brethel. What are they firing at? There's nothing close enough, is there? I guess maybe there is. Eagle-Eyed of Androth, but this is kind of a waste of ammunition, honestly, given how depleted they are already and how the Warder of Brethel would be able to handle this situation adequately without any support, so these are the little details that do add up over time. Bane of the Incomers will retreat. Huskarlar are routing, interestingly enough. The Warder have their victory, such as it is. Well, Mangonel's in a decent position to try and attack as the enemy advance, but I suppose what the attacks are doing is surveying the situation and thinking, well, this isn't too appealing a prospect, but they don't really have too much of a choice in the matter. They are the attackers after all, so it is up to them to take the initiative. Haladin's still doing that with their projectiles so far, trying to whittle down the enemy. And the Marjrout will be able to inflict some pretty decent damage on the Hewing Guildsmen with some well-connecting volleys. Bladesmen of Barad-Ithor moving forth. Eagle-eyed. I mean, they are moving forward with some infantry as well, so Alexander Tenku moving forward with his Bladesmen of Barad-Ithor. I mean, he's going to be introduced to the business end of the Scions of TOL, so I can't imagine these Bladesmen are going to enjoy their time too much. I mean, with how lightly armoured the Scions are, the Bladesmen could do some damage in response, but surely they're going to get decimated before they ever truly get the chance. Eagle-eyed of Androth moving into melee to support them. I mean, this is perhaps the most fruitful grounds for an attacking location for the attackers, and they are making the most of it. A good opportunity perhaps for the attack to begin on the other sides as well, just to give the defenders plenty to think about. Wardens of Nargothrond blocking the advance of the other Fingolfin army and their units of Bladesmen of Barad-Ithor. Once again, the armour piercing will give the Wardens the edge they need, combined with that defensive prowess that most spearmen tend to hold. But Ishbak-Raz hunters offering the kind of support as well. Support readily available. Herdsmen of Mithrim. The armour piercing in response to the Wardens of Nargothrond is also a useful thing. Are they attacking through the middle as well? I mean, kind of. Mariners of Alqualonde are here, trying to do damage with their javelins. I mean, I say kind of. In fact, Valinor are moving forward with significant gusto, with some support from the Bladesmen of Barad-Ithor over here. Once again, these skirmishers are being caught out in melee, but the bright side for that is they're going to be able to hit the sides of the Hearthguard of Tyrion here, and they're going to be able to do a good amount of damage as well, with javelins in behind. So a lot of the TOL and Gaurhoth skirmishers may have been caught out in melee fairly soon into their combat on this battle, but they've been able to utilise their ammunition still pretty well. Looks like the Scarahai Longfangs just ran out of ammunition, so they can now devote their full attention to the Bladesmen, which will at least mean they don't die off quite so quickly. Trappers still doing their thing. I mean, that was some good damage they did as well. Yet again, the Valinor units are the ones taking the brunt of this. Mariners moving in, the Wardens of Nargothrond representing the sturdy front line. AP spear to AP spear. Over yonder, some sentries of Hithlum. The Scions of TOL actually taking a lot of damage. I would suggest, yeah, Marines of Vinyamar focusing them down in melee. And I would suggest that they're probably not alone in that regard either. Rigsware of Brethil being engaged in melee as well. The other unit of Pyre Wolves doing their thing, and you have to say the sentries of Hithlum pretty much the ideal target. Their armour values are not going to be enough to save them from the flaming shot. Obviously that comes down to balance purposes. Under normal circumstances, I'd actually suggest that heavy armour would be worse for trying to deal with flaming projectiles like this, because you'd be boiled alive inside it, but there's no way in Medieval 2 to make something effective against heavy units but not effective against light units in projectile terms, so for the sake of balance this is how it must be. Dragon Guard of Dorloman engaging with the Bane of the Incomers and their supporting Grey Elven units over here, indeed the Elves of the Twilight Hearth. Not a two-handed spear unit in the end, a shield and spear unit, so perhaps more defensively apt than many of the other Grey Elven units, and they will help to stop the Fingolfin advance over here. Outlaws are ready, hunters can also get into position. Is there going to be the beginnings of an assault over here? There is. Warder of Brethil moving forward, but there is still a good enough Grey Elven force over here that they can stave off a token Haladin effort. These Pyre Wolves, I mean, they have been the target of a lot of the attackers' attentions, but that hasn't stopped them from being pretty effective, and the Haladin will hate being up against a unit like the Pyre Wolves. These Huskal are getting grilled. Meanwhile, these sentries of Hithlum getting into position. They're going pike to pike against the Bridge Wards, but the Bridge Wards were in a more set position, and they're the better pike unit anyway, so these sentries are going to find themselves outclassed. What was that? That was Sauron with his own sorceries, with the Bane of the Incomers doing a lot of damage to those Marines of Vinyamar. Yeah, and this is surely going to be the end of the sentries as they break. The Bridge Wards holding them in place, and Sauron using his fire sorcery to send them running for the hills. Catapult crew, who are of course themselves Wardens of Nargothrond, getting into place. Ishbukraz's Pyre Walls moving over here to focus down the Teleri units that Valinor are sending forwards. I mean, it's punishing this for the attackers, but it's whether or not, as we've seen so often in these battles, whether or not the defenders have got enough manpower to actually maintain this kind of defence. The attackers always seem to have more when you're looking at these battles from a defensive perspective, and it's always difficult to finally get them to fall away. Meanwhile, more Dragon Guard, more Bladesmen of Barad Eiffel being backed up by some Marines of Vinyamar, Warns of Nargothrond. And interestingly enough, the company of Prince Gwindor, where the Finarfin general is, was in melee over here, which is risky business. Yeah, I was going to say, the Arqueni Mor Magilwa would probably be best committed over here. Their quality is going to be significant. There's also a unit of Bridge Wards in here, but in come the Arqueni. Going to have more quality than anything the attackers have on the front line over here. Sentries of Hithlum trying to add their own pike presence to the front line once again, are Fingolfin, but again they're facing the masters of that kind of warfare. Marksmen of Nargothrond in a good position to use their split shot projectiles. Kind of a more focused version of what the Bane of the Incomers now have on the sliding scale. Ishbukraz's Hunters out of ammunition. In comes Sauron out of his projectile, and he's going to, I mean, obviously he's a very effective unit in melee with sort of an arm, well, I say probably is armor piercing as well with that hammer that he wields, but there goes the Valinor general. But area of effect melee attacks as well, and none of these units are going to be particularly good at taking him down. Of the attacking units, the Tyrian two-handed swordsman, the Sons of Hurin might be the best one actually, given the huge armor piercing edge their damage has, and even Sauron's armour won't be enough to save him from that. Sentries of Hithlum moving forward. There's really no pikes over here, so this is one of the attacking positions where the Sentries of Hithlum may actually be as effective as the attackers want them to be. Elves of the Twilight Hearth pushing forward. Grey Elves going on to the offensive to a certain extent, forcing the Finarfin and Haladen units over here back a little bit, including the dangerous dismounted Mardrout. Over here, Haladin having to take sole responsibility for this attack. Another unit of Swerdabrothier moving in to back up the border of Brethil, but the Hugin Gilson with that armour piercing going to be too much. Yes, the Swerdabrothier will do damage in return. That relentless trait will pay dividends there, but it won't be enough to secure victory, which is a problem. They're going to need to rely on the support of units like these Huskarlar to deal the damage that is necessary. And they will be able to do that, at least to a certain extent. The Hunts of Mithrim, though, will respond in kind. Another unit of Order of Brethil moving forward, but that's really just the equivalent of throwing more logs on the fire, really. They're only going to last so long. They'll keep the attack going, but they won't win you this battle by any means. They kind of need to keep that attack going, though, because they need those Huskarlar to be in position to back up the Swerdabrothier, and the Hugin Guildsmen are ripping their way through a lot of the units that they've got over here. There is another unit of dismounted Mardrout, but in melee they are just reasonably tanky spears. The damage that the Hugin Guildsmen are going to be able to chuck out is going to be too much for them. So yeah, the Grey Elves will be feeling pretty confident about their chances over here, unless the Haladen have got more they can put forward. Another unit of Huskarlar, another unit of Swerdabrothier. It's decent reinforcement, so it's in the balance, but the Grey Elves will still be happy for now that they can commit other units elsewhere to help out. Irimo Arrant are actually forcing their way through here, and the Bridge Wards finding themselves overrun. Dismounted Mardrout being committed forward. I mean, it's a pretty chaotic battle over here at this point, which, weirdly enough, seems to be favouring the defenders for now. Dismounted Mardrout. Huskarlar are also moving in. A lot of these are skirmishers that are out of ammunition on both sides of the divide, actually. There's more lookouts though, so they'll probably be alright, pulling out that little sickle that they have as a sidearm, and the Elves of the Twilight Hearth will surely be enough to rout those Huskarlar in double quick time. Dismounted Mardrout still have some ammunition over here, so they have 3 units of dismounted Mardrout, which is a big investment, but They would not be the only faction on the field that has invested heavily into such a unit. Sons of Húrin and Irimo Arantar have stuck to one another like glue in this battle so far, and it's given Alexander's Fingolfin army a real point of quality. Surprised perhaps that more javelins have not been forthcoming. Going after those Dragon Guard. Point blank hits from the Scarahai trappers, but again they're going to be torn up in melee. Sentries of Hithlum. Herdsmen of Hithlum moving forward now as well, so Mariners of Alqualonde making their last stand, but they're going to be victorious over here, the attackers. They'll push through that area over there. TOL and Gaurhoth and Finarfin still holding back this blob of herdsmen of Hithlum, but it also means they can't reinforce this little river crossing over here. The frame rate's starting to take a few dips in this battle, which is a little bit concerning. Scarahai trappers doing their best to do the damage, what damage they can, but they'll probably crumble pretty quickly, and that's going to lead to an interesting little situation, because the Grey Elves are actually doing well over here, but with the attackers winning there, it's going to cut them off, I think, from the rest of the Finarfin and TOL and Gaurhoth units that are over on this side. Hishbukraz Ash Priests going to tear their way through this unit of herdsmen of Hithlum without too much difficulty. Irimo Arantar and the Sons of Húrin over here still doing their thing. I mean, the bridge wards have been effective in this fight. They haven't been the be-all and end-all. I think the attackers have done reasonably well, all things considered. Quani Moore McGill are doing their best, but they're up against 2 bodyguard units, including a shock and... I thought it was going to crash then for a second. That was worrying. Come on, game. Hold up. You'll be fine. Monks and Nargothrond still have a bit of ammunition. There you can see a javelin volley hitting the Ash Priests. Dragon Guard know what's a dangerous unit in this sort of situation. I mean, the Ash Priests are another incredibly dangerous shock infantry unit in melee. With the Relentless trait, you could argue in certain situations they could be more effective than the Sons of Húrin, but from a more conventional perspective, when, as you would want to be, are winning the battle, Sons of Húrin probably still the superior unit. The Grey Elves pulling back a little bit, seeing that with the arrival of some of these slightly scarier Valinor units, they can't really afford to continue to be on the offensive universally. They're having to leave this unit of Sentries of Mithrim behind as a sort of rearguard action, really. Continuing to try and whittle down the dismounted Mardrout, but Dragon Guard of Dor Loman moving in, Hearthguard of Tyrion. Those Grey Elves are going to be utterly overwhelmed. Dismounted Mardrout continuing to be hounded on all fronts, really. Lookouts of Mithrim, but on this occasion the Mardrout are going to be superior to the basic unit of archers for the Grey Elves. That's going to be good enough for them. Over here, meanwhile, looks like the Grey Elves are preparing a bit of a final stand for themselves in maybe a little bit of an unlikely spot. They've done a good job at dealing so far with the attentions of the Haladin. Sauron's over here now, actually backing them up as well, so maybe future-proofing themselves a little bit, the defenders, seeing that this may very well be where they make their last stand. They want their single most powerful unit in here to offer his support. The Sentries of Mithrim broken. No longer will they be effective in melee. There goes the TOL and Gaurhoth general, interestingly enough in the catapult crew. Sentinels of Tyrion still in actually pretty fine health, which is worrying for the defenders when you've got units of this kind of quality. Whittling them down with projectiles may be less viable than it once was, and this is also the kind of unit, remember, that Sauron isn't going to be as good at dealing with sheer martial might, especially when even stuff like the Herdsmen of Hithlum may not be of the highest quality. There's so many of them, and they are an armor-piercing shock unit that things could get pretty dicey for them here. Ash Priests actually were enough to turn this fight around alongside the Wardens and Bridge Wards. At least to the point where Fingolfin over here is going to have to settle for a Pyrrhic victory. The Irimo Arans are really not going to enjoy going up against the Ash Priests in this fashion. Yes, quite so. Victory seems certain, only a fool could lose this battle. Dragon Guard of Dor Loman still biding their time as well, with their projectiles still. More Marines of Vinyamar, so Fingolfin is certainly depleted over here, but they're going to get the support of plenty of these herdsmen to help finally finish this defensive position off. And there is the Finarfin and TOL, what is largely going to be a Finarfin, I think, last stand over here, and the Grey Elven one on the other side. So the defenders are split. Will the attackers try to deal with them one by one, or split their forces a little bit to deal with them in that way? We are into the final 10,000 frames at this point, so Ash Priests are going to retreat as well. The Dragon Guard of Dorloman going to take this opportunity to do some damage with their projectiles, knock them over, and that will actually, I think, be enough for the Herdsmen of Hithlam to catch them up in melee. So more so the staggering effect, rather than the damage, is actually going to be the more effective aspect of that, because you'll kill off a few of them, but you'll also make it so that a few of them are damaged by the Herdsmen of Hithlam. Although the one that they've managed to catch, you can see there the example of it being a relentless unit, taking heavy axe blows and still not staggering. Meanwhile, Haladin moving further forward is going to try and break the enemy down a little bit with the Huskalar ammunition, but TOL and Gaurhoth with the Ash Priests on one side and Sauron on the other. They've got 2 units of genuine quality trying to add to the final stands of both Mithrim and Finarfin. Mardrouter there. Sauron moving back, just menacing the Huskalar, forcing them onto the back foot somewhat. Sentinels of Tyrion leading the way, leading the charge. The rest of the Fingolfin army will surely follow, and still I think Alexander and Farkin's Fingolfin armies probably the healthiest on the field. Farkin in particular, given the fact that it's actually been Valinor who have taken a lot of the initial hits so far. Marksman Nargothrond going to get into melee. I mean, heavy sword to heavy sword, but operating in 2 completely different leagues, and Valinor will be very pleased that this is the kind of fight they have taken. And I think this is pretty much it as far as the final stand goes. It's just this unit of marksmen and the company of Prince Gwindor, which is not going to be enough to withstand too much of a beating. Is there anything else up here? Not really. I think this was the intended final stand, to be honest, but it is going to be over on the other side of the outer wall where the Grey Elves are going to have to make do. On this occasion, actually, the waterways inside the settlement, cutting the defenders off from one another, as useful as they were earlier on, they have now actually proven to be perhaps more of a liability than a help. Is that going to be enough to give the attackers victory? Sentinels. Yeah, that'll be enough. I mean, the Sentinels on their own would probably be enough here. Given the amount of units they still have over here, they could do with siphoning off a little bit of support to dislodge the defenders over here. Still trying to use their skirmishers, aren't they? Very depleted unit of dismounted Mardrout, but doing their best to use their throwing projectiles. But now seeing the opportunity to charge downhill, catch the Huskalar out. He's not going to be able to get out of this one, Nevin. Moving forward to try and use his throwing action, but instead he's going to be met with the Hewing Guildsmen and all the rest of the Grey Elves. I think, to be honest, the defenders don't have too much of a choice but to try and be aggressive here, because I think they are going to need to finish off the kind of almost token force that the Haladin have over here. They have the advantage in terms of strength over here, I think, still. The Haladin being as depleted as they are. Dismounted Mardrout will do damage to them for sure, but the Outlaws of Hithlam with their 2-handed spear. Whatever happened to Sauron? Where did he go? Is he blending in to the fight? There he is. But yeah, they need to deal with this attack over here and deal with it quickly with enough strength left, because if they don't, they're going to find themselves on the receiving end of a real beating. And already I think Fingolfin see that this is the case. They're going to send over some battered bodyguard units and a unit of Dragon Guard to start working away on that assault over there. So the defenders will win that fight there, and the attackers will certainly win this one over here. It's just a case of who's going to come out of this better, given the quality that Valinor still have at their disposal, given the fact there's still pikes as well. Late game pikes like the Sentries of Hithlam. All of the common sense that I've accrued regarding Medieval 2 in the past would point towards an attacker victory from this point on. The company of Prince Gwyndor doing their best, but horrendously outmatched given the calibre of their foe. I mean, if the sentries of Hithlum push their way into the lines like this, they will actually take a decent amount of damage from the Finarfin swordsmen, but maybe it'll be enough to rout them as well. Finarfin general finally falls. Well, there is the Half-Guard of Tyrion over here, so Valinor sending forward support for the Haladin, but too little too late. This savage counter-attack from the Grey Elves has dealt with the Haladin quite nicely, and you can see how in both of these previous fights you've actually seen how the Grey Elves have certainly got the beating of the Haladin with regards to infantry, which shouldn't be too surprising. In the last fight we saw how well they did against the Avari, and the cavalry they had in the late game was enough to turn it around. On this occasion I think the Haladin are going to have to lean on their allies fairly heavily to help finish the Grey Elves off. I mean, yes, Sauron is somewhat corrupting the results of this fight, but the same would be true with or without Sauron if it were just the Haladin over here. I mean, what Sauron is going to offer is the possibility of doing or providing a little bit more of a sporting final stand against the rest of the attackers moving over here. More herdsmen of Hithlum on the way. Company of Prince Gwyndor now. They're falling off that unit cliff that can often happen, having their manpower whittled down very, very quickly. Some Sons of Hurin in there, still the Sentinels of Tyrion. I mean, they have been a little bit damaged, but certainly nowhere near enough to worry the attackers all that much. I like the capes on the House of Finarfin's units as well. Still some Valinor units, which is interesting. I mean, they took a real beating earlier on, and even when the assault on the settlement began, they were still the target of the defenders' affections. Surely that's going to be that from a Finarfin perspective, so all of Belagost's army has been dealt with. Tiring is one way to put it. They've been utterly defeated at this point, and that means we have one final defence to consider. That's going to be this one over here. I mean, so far, the fact that they've been filing into this defensive position has actually not been great for the attackers, because it's allowed the Grey Elven damage and of course the damage of Sauron to be effective. I mean, there are still 12 Sons of Hurin, which will surely be enough to cause Sauron problems. Do damage to the Dragon Guard. The Outlaws of Hithlum, the final unit they have really in reserve, just being committed forward now. And I guess at this point, given that it's the final position, we'll go up to ×2 speed. It's really just a matter of, surely when the Tyrion two-handed swordsmen arrive, things will go a bit differently. Dragon Guard of Dorloman, they're taking a lot of damage. You can see how deadly Sauron is in melee. The fact he's a single entity unit means when you start to burn him down with the kind of damage he's weak to, like a more complete unit of Sons of Hurin rather than the damaged one that we saw previously, which was largely dealt with by the supporting Grey Elves. I mean, to be honest with you, that attack has gone so badly that maybe there will be the opportunity for some a comeback for the defenders here. Hunters of Mithrim moving forward, going to interrupt the javelins of the Marines of Vinyamar. Trying to shoot at Sauron over there, but the Grey Elves are going to try and deal with the Marines before they can inflict too much damage to the big guy. Elves of the Twilight Hearth still alive as well, 27 of them, that's nothing too insignificant. What else have we got going on over here? I mean, the Outlaws of Hithlum, they're dealing with what was a unit of dismounted Mardrout out there on that dock. Elsewhere, Elves of the Twilight Hearth and more of these more basic Grey Elven spears moving forward. Going to try and can see all of the reinforcements menacingly approaching in the background, but they're going to try and deal with this one unit of Marines of Vinumar before they arrive. Take the attackers apart piece by piece. That, I would assume, is the Haladen general. Well, I think that's kind of a moot point at this point, because I don't really have all that much left anyway. Elders of the Twilight Hearth. Yeah, the Marines of Vinumar have been broken, and now the Grey Elves can get back into a more comfortable defensive position for them as the rest of the attackers arrive. I mean, just having a look at this, they're going to be reliant on the Sentinels of Tyrion here, the attackers, in order to see themselves over the line. Again, it's a little bit stretched. Fingolfin needs to keep pace a little bit better with Valinor. Maybe Valinor needs to wait up and let Fingolfin catch up, one or the other. But that seems to have been a bit of a problem between Tommy the Wise and Farkin since the opening moments of this fight. They haven't been quite on the same page in terms of timing. Swear to Prothea over there from Nevin. The rest of the dismounted Marjart being poked to death by their fellow man. The traitors from Mithrim that they are. One Blazeman of Beradithel being slowly stabbed to death by all these spears. Looks like they're forming up a little bit of a defensive perimeter around Sauron. I think this is because Tundra's Fox actually left the game, or was booted from the game because of his instant or something like that. So that means Sauron couldn't actually move, but he can still be effective in battle. But this means, of course, the Grey Elves need to form a defensive position around them. Fighters 1, Sentinels of Tyrion, I mean, very clearly are going to tear their way through Outlaws of Hithlum without too much damage suffered in response. Spear Malice, very basic human unit and all that. Well, here comes Sauron. And to be fair, the Herdsman, probably the unit he will deal with best, but he dies very, very quickly. And that is really going to be that. The quality that the Sentinels of Tyrion have is going to be too much. Without Sauron's area of effect attacks. There's also pikes in the mix there as well. But a close battle, and it does go to show as well that combination of numbers, quality, skirmishers that the attackers picked in terms of their composition was right. Very chaotic fight this as well though. There was good and bad aspects to both sides, but the attackers, of course, as always, when they have an army advantage, are going to have more margin for error, and that certainly proved to be the case here. But still a deserved victory this. Having a look. Yeah, 5% difference seems about right, given how this battle has gone. Interesting to see what did the damage, although we're only going to be able to see it from a Finarfin perspective. And there we have it. The third Silmarillion battle replay that I've done in the space of a month just about, which is the most I've done, even when it had only just come out. I think this is the most I've done, which is good. Lord of Valagos actually with the lowest amount of kills on his team, but that's not too surprising given the fact he was less focused on his skirmishers, which of course is the defenders. That's always how you're going to be able to do quite a lot of damage, with Tundra's Fox being able to make use of Sauron, the Pyre Wolves, even the basic archers and the javelins. While a lot of them got caught out maybe a little bit early, they were still able to do a good amount of damage, and the Grey Elves, of course, with all their archers, also proving to be very effective indeed actually, with by far the most kills on the field, approaching 3,000. Proving to be quite a savage archer faction, aren't they, the Grey Elves, as we've seen in the last 3 battles. As for the attackers, Haladin struggled a little bit more, but they were up against the Grey Elves, which, as we've seen, when the Grey Elves are dug in, does seem to be quite a difficult matchup for the Haladin to do much in. They tried their best with their throwing projectiles, and they weren't completely contained by the defenders, is probably the best way to put it, but they were still struggling more so than their heavier elven allies, and in particular actually Valinor in the end. Despite some of the slightly questionable choices he made earlier on, Tommy the Wise, he was still very, very key and instrumental in the attackers' victory here through sheer quality. Probably one of the better examples actually of Valinor's real high-end infantry quality proving to be very, very key. And it was the heavy Tyrion units, I think, which were also vital to that. So what did the damage for Finarfin? Arqueni Morma Gilwa in melee, considering they were going up against some of the better Fingolfin units as well. That's quite impressive. Marksman of Nargothrond, not too surprising. Skirmishers on the defence are always going to be pretty effective. I mean, the unit above them didn't do too well, but 285 kind of rounds out both units to be an average performance from them both. Archers of Talathdin are doing okay, and a detachment of swordsmen of Talathdin as well. Catapult may be slightly disappointing. Again, another aspect in which if the catapult had been used a little bit more effectively, that could have turned the battle around. Same could go for the mangonel. We didn't really get to see that in action, but that's because they waited too long to use it. Should have been used as the enemy was on the advance in much the same way the Bane of the Incomers were. But it is what it is. In the end, I think worthy victors were the attackers. So, big thank you to Lord of Belagos, and a big thank you to all of the players who were a part of this battle replay. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you will join me for whatever is next.